I walked into my parents' dining room carrying a casserole dish, watching my 8-year-old daughter, Emma, and 6-year-old son, Jake, trail behind me with nervous excitement. Thanksgiving had always been special for our family, but this year felt different. My sister Sarah's children were already seated at the main table, wrapped gifts positioned beside their china plates like royal treasures. Dad looked up from carving the turkey, his expression cold as winter stone. "Your kids can sit on the floor," he said, pointing toward the living room carpet, while my sister's children occupied the front seats with their feast spread before them. My mom emerged from the kitchen, adding salt to the wound. They should learn not everything is for them. I felt my chest tighten as Emma's small hand gripped mine confusion, clouding her innocent brown eyes. Jake shuffled his feet against the hardwood, clutching the handmade Thanksgiving card he had spent hours crafting for Grandpa. The contrast was stark and deliberate. Sarah's twins, Madison and Cooper, sat like little princes at the polished mahogany table, their matching outfits crisp and new, while my children stood beside me in their carefully chosen but clearly second-hand clothes. "I understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the clatter of silverware and the low hum of conversation. But as I guided Emma and Jake toward the living room with their paper plates and plastic forks, something inside me began to fracture. The event coordinator, a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a professional bun, appeared from the kitchen carrying a clipboard. I had assumed my parents had hired help for the holiday, which seemed unusual given their typically modest celebrations. She approached the dining room with purpose pen poised over her papers. "Excuse me, I need to confirm the final head count for billing," she announced, scanning the room with practiced efficiency. As I positioned myself between the living room and dining area, helping Emma spread a throw blanket on the carpet for their makeshift meal, I overheard Sarah lean toward her husband, Marcus. Her voice carried just enough for me to catch fragments, though she clearly believed herself unheard. "The inheritance plan is working perfectly," she murmured, adjusting Cooper's napkin with theatrical motherly care. "Dad's lawyer confirmed the will changes went through last month. Once Hilton stops coming around, there won't be any complications." My hands froze while arranging Jake's plastic cup. The words hit me like ice water in my veins. Inheritance plan. Will changes. The pieces began clicking together with horrifying clarity. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the room before responding in a hushed tone. "Are you certain this dinner theater approach is necessary?" "Seems pretty elaborate just to push him away." "Trust me," Sarah replied, her smile never wavering, as she helped Madison cut her turkey. "Dad needs to see how different our families are, how responsible we are compared to his mess of a son. The contrast has to be obvious." I continued setting up the children's meal, my movements mechanical while my mind raced. My grandfather had passed away 3 months ago, and I had been so consumed with my own struggles following the divorce that I hadn't given much thought to estate matters. Grandpa Joe had been the family patriarch, a man who had built a successful hardware store from nothing and always treated all his grandchildren equally. The coordinator cleared her throat louder, drawing attention back to her presence. "I need to confirm how many guests will be dining at the main table versus alternative seating arrangements." Sarah practically jumped from her chair, smoothing her burgundy sweater with nervous energy. "Oh, we have 6 at the main table and the other arrangements are exactly as discussed." Alternative arrangements. I found myself speaking before fully considering my words. The coordinator consulted her notes, professional smile firmly in place. "Your sister arranged for the children's floor picnic setup just as requested. She was very specific about the seating hierarchy when she contacted our catering service." The room fell silent except for the soft clink of Madison's fork against her plate. My parents exchanged glances and I watched Dad's face redden slightly. Sarah's complexion had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Sarah arranged this dinner," I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake building inside my chest. "Of course," the coordinator replied, consulting her clipboard again. "Miss Sarah Henderson, contacted us 2 weeks ago requesting a formal Thanksgiving service with specific instructions about seating arrangements and meal presentation differences. My sister's married name hung in the air like smoke. Henderson, not our family name of Morrison. She had orchestrated this entire humiliation, hiring professional help to stage what I had believed was a family gathering. I think there might be some confusion, I said, carefully watching Sarah's expression shift from confident to panicked. But the coordinator continued oblivious to the tension crackling through the room. No confusion at all. Your sister was very clear about creating a memorable experience that would highlight family dynamics. She mentioned this was particularly important for demonstrating responsibility and worthiness to your father. The last word landed like a physical blow. Worthiness. Sarah had hired professionals to orchestrate my humiliation in front of my children to demonstrate my unworthiness to Dad in the most calculated way possible. Emma looked up from her paper plate turkey growing cold while she watched the adult conversation unfold. Jake had stopped eating entirely. His small hands folded in his lap as he sensed the shifting atmosphere. What inheritance plan? I asked directly, no longer caring about maintaining family peace. Sarah's facade cracked completely. Hilton, you're making a scene in front of the children. Answer the question. Dad set down his carving knife with deliberate precision. Your grandfather left specific instructions about family assets being distributed to responsible family members who demonstrate proper values. Proper values, I repeated slowly, glancing at my children sitting on the floor while their cousins enjoyed a catered feast. Values like stability, good judgment, and putting family first. Mom added, her voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone repeating practiced talking points. I looked at Emma and Jake, my heart breaking for their confused faces and the growing understanding that they were being treated as lesser members of their own family. Then I looked at Sarah, whose expensive jewelry and designer clothes told a story of someone who had never struggled to buy her children winter coats or worried about making rent after paying childcare costs. The coordinator shifted uncomfortably clearly, realizing she had stepped into family drama far beyond simple catering logistics. Perhaps I should return to the kitchen and let you resolve the headcount question. Actually, I said, standing slowly and feeling something fundamental shift inside me, I think we need to have a different conversation entirely. The coordinator retreated toward the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile with obvious discomfort. I remained standing beside my children, who had abandoned their plates entirely to watch the unfolding drama with wide, uncertain eyes. What exactly did Grandpa Joe leave behind? I asked, my voice cutting through the artificial warmth Sarah had been projecting all afternoon. Dad cleared his throat, avoiding direct eye contact. The estate includes the hardware store, the cabin up at Lake Morton, some investments and provisions for the grandchildren's education. Some investments, I repeated flatly. Can you be more specific? Sarah jumped in quickly, her voice bright with forced cheer. Really, Hilton, is this the time we're trying to have a nice family dinner? A family dinner you catered specifically to humiliate my children. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was past caring about politeness. My phone buzzed against my leg, and I glanced at the screen to see a text from Thomas Brennan, Grandpa Joe's old business partner. I'd met Thomas several times over the years at family barbecues and Christmas gatherings. He was a straightforward man in his 70s who had worked alongside my grandfather for over 30 years before they both retired. The message was brief but urgent. Need to talk to you immediately about Joe's estate. There are documents your family hasn't seen. Can you call me? I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. Thomas had always been meticulous about business matters, the type of man who kept detailed records and never made statements he couldn't back up with facts. Excuse me for one moment, I said, stepping toward the hallway. I need to take this call. Hilton, sit down. Dad commanded, his voice carrying the authority he had wielded when I was a child. We're in the middle of dinner. A dinner Sarah hired professionals to stage, I replied, holding up my phone. This will just take a minute. I walked into the hallway and dialed Thomas's number. He answered before the second ring. Hilton, thank God you called. Where are you right now? At my parents' house for Thanksgiving dinner. Thomas, what's going on with Grandpa's estate? Listen carefully. Your grandfather set up a trust fund specifically for your children 3 months before he died. Emma and Jake each have $25,000 set aside for college, and there's an additional inheritance of $400,000 designated for you personally. My knees nearly buckled. $400,000, Emma and Jake's college funds. I leaned against the hallway wall, struggling to process the information. That's impossible, I whispered. Nobody told me anything about a trust or inheritance. That's because the documents were never properly filed with the probate court. Your father was supposed to handle the paperwork after Joe's death, but he claimed there was a health scare that prevented him from managing estate business. I remembered Dad's mysterious hospital visit in August right after Grandpa's funeral. He had been vague about the details, mentioning chest pains and stress tests, but had seemed perfectly fine within a few days. Thomas, my father, didn't have any health scare. He was golfing with his retirement buddies the following weekend. I suspected as much. Hilton, I think your family has been deliberately hiding these documents from you. Your grandfather specifically wanted you to inherit the lake cabin and a significant portion of his liquid assets. He was very concerned about your situation after the divorce. The lake cabin. I had spent countless childhood summers there with Grandpa Joe, learning to fish and helping him maintain the property. He'd always joked about leaving it to me someday, but I had assumed those were just the casual promises older relatives make to children. Why would they hide this from me? I asked, though pieces of the puzzle were already forming in my mind. Your grandfather mentioned some family tension in his final months. He was worried that your sister was pressuring your parents to consolidate family assets for her children's benefit. Joe specifically told me he wanted to ensure your kids had opportunities, despite your divorce difficulties. Through the hallway archway, I could see Sarah pacing near the dining table, her earlier composure completely shattered. She kept glancing toward the hallway where I stood, clearly anxious about my phone conversation. Thomas, do you have copies of these documents? I have everything. Original will trust paperwork and correspondence between Joe and his attorney. Your grandfather asked me to oversee certain aspects of the estate specifically because he was concerned about potential family conflicts. My hands were shaking as I gripped the phone. $400,000 would change everything for Emma and Jake. No more shopping at thrift stores for school clothes. No more choosing between heating bills and grocery money. No more lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering how I would afford Emma's dental work or Jake's asthma medications. Can you bring these documents here to my parents' house? I'm already in the car. I was hoping you'd ask that. I should be there within 2 hours. 2 hours. I repeated, my voice gaining strength. Thomas, what exactly has been happening with the estate distribution? From what I can piece together, your sister has been working with your parents to redirect your inheritance toward her children. They filed paperwork claiming you're financially irresponsible and potentially unfit to manage inherited assets. The words hit like physical blows. Financially irresponsible. Unfit. I thought about the 60-hour work weeks I had been pulling at the construction company, the overtime shifts I took to afford Christmas presents for Emma and Jake, the careful budgeting that allowed us to live in a decent apartment despite my limited income. They're claiming I'm irresponsible. According to the paperwork, I've seen they're using your divorce as evidence of poor judgment and instability. There are also references to concerns about your mental state and ability to provide for the children. I closed my eyes, remembering the custody battle that had drained my savings and nearly destroyed my relationship with Emma and Jake. My ex-wife, Jennifer, had painted me as an unstable father, someone who prioritized his own interests over the children's welfare. The court battles had been brutal, filled with accusations and character assassinations that left me questioning everything about myself. Thomas? My divorce was difficult, but I've never been irresponsible with money or neglected my children. I know that, and so did your grandfather. That's exactly why he set up these protections for you and the kids. He saw what the divorce was doing to you financially and wanted to ensure you had resources to rebuild. I could hear Sarah's voice from the dining room, pitched higher than normal, as she spoke with Mom and Dad in urgent, hushed tones. The catered dinner continued around my children, who remained on the living room floor with their paper plates and confused expressions. Hilton, there's something else you need to know, Thomas continued. I have reason to believe your ex-wife and your sister have been coordinating their efforts. What do you mean coordinating? Bank records show payments from your sister to Jennifer's divorce attorney, significant payments starting about 6 months before your grandfather's death. The hallway seemed to tilt around me. Sarah had been paying Jennifer's lawyer. The custody battle that had cost me everything, that had turned my children's mother against me and drained my resources, had been financed by my own sister. How much money are we talking about? Over $15,000 in payments to the law firm, all from Sarah's personal account. I leaned heavily against the wall, struggling to breathe. The custody battle had been deliberately escalated and prolonged, not because Jennifer genuinely believed I was an unfit father, but because my sister was paying to destroy my credibility and financial stability. She wanted me broke. I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. She wanted me to look like a failure so I couldn't challenge whatever story they told about the inheritance. That's my assessment as well. A man dealing with a contentious divorce, drained of resources, struggling to maintain custody of his children, would be easy to characterize as unstable and unworthy of inherited wealth. I could see Emma and Jake through the archway, sitting quietly on their blanket, while their cousins enjoyed dessert at the formal table. My daughter's small hand was patting Jake's shoulder, trying to comfort him as he watched the adults with growing confusion. I need to get back in there, I told Thomas. But please hurry with those documents. One more thing, Hilton. Your grandfather included a letter specifically for you explaining his concerns about family manipulation and his hopes for your future. I think you're going to want to read that before you have any more conversations with your parents or sister. The call ended, and I stood in the hallway for several long moments, trying to process the magnitude of what I had just learned. My own family had conspired to steal my inheritance, destroy my marriage, and ensure my children grew up believing they were second-class members of their own extended family. When I returned to the dining room, Sarah immediately approached me with forced brightness. Everything okay? You were gone for quite a while. I looked at her carefully applied makeup, her designer jewelry, her perfectly coordinated outfit. This was a woman who had never worried about money, never chosen between paying rent and buying medicine for sick children, never worked construction in freezing weather because it was the only job that paid enough to maintain custody rights. Actually, Sarah, everything is about to become very interesting. I walked back into the dining room, my perspective completely transformed by Thomas's revelations. Sarah watched me with barely concealed anxiety, her fingers drumming against the polished table surface. The catered turkey sat partially carved, surrounded by elaborate side dishes that suddenly seemed like props in an elaborate theater production. Who was on the phone? Dad asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp with interest. Thomas Brennan. I replied, watching for reactions around the room. Grandpa Joe's business partner. Sarah's face went pale beneath her foundation. She gripped her wine glass tighter, the crystal stem appearing fragile between her manicured fingers. What did Thomas want? Mom asked, emerging from the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee, her movements stiff with tension. He wanted to discuss some estate documents that apparently never made it to probate court. I kept my voice level, watching as Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Marcus. Estate documents, Dad repeated, setting down his carving knife with deliberate precision. Thomas isn't involved in estate management. He's just an old business partner. Actually, Dad, Grandpa Joe specifically asked Thomas to oversee certain aspects of the inheritance distribution. particularly the parts involving trust funds for the grandchildren and property transfers. The room fell silent except for the soft scraping of Madison's fork against her plate. Emma and Jake had stopped pretending to eat both children, sensing the adult tension crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Sarah cleared her throat, attempting to regain control of the conversation. Hilton, I think you might be confused about Grandpa's intentions. Dad and I have been working closely with the estate attorney to ensure everything is handled properly. Handled properly? I repeated slowly. Like hiring caterers to stage this dinner so you could demonstrate my unworthiness in front of witnesses. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact with anyone at the table. I had always sensed he was uncomfortable with Sarah's more manipulative tendencies, but he typically stayed silent during family conflicts. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Thomas. 15 minutes away. Have additional evidence you need to see immediately. Thomas is on his way here. I announced, watching Sarah's carefully composed expression crack slightly. He has documents to show us. Documents about what? Mom demanded, her voice rising with agitation. About the trust funds Grandpa set up for Emma and Jake. About the $400,000 he left specifically for me. About the lake cabin that was supposed to be transferred to my name. Dad's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. That's impossible. There are no separate trust funds or property transfers. Are you sure about that, Dad? Or is it possible that the paperwork got delayed due to your convenient health scare in August? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Dad's face reddened, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composed facade. I had legitimate medical concerns. He protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Concerns that disappeared as soon as the estate paperwork filing deadlines passed. Sarah slammed her wine glass down on the table, causing Madison and Cooper to jump in surprise. This is ridiculous. Thomas Brennan is a retired old man who probably doesn't understand current estate law. You're grasping at straws because you can't accept that Grandpa Joe made responsible decisions about family assets. Responsible decisions, I said, my voice gaining strength. Like ensuring his great-grandchildren sit on the floor during family dinners while their cousins enjoy catered meals. Like watching his grandson work 60-hour weeks in construction while his granddaughter takes European vacations. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. Sarah, maybe we should listen to what Thomas has to say. Marcus, don't be ridiculous. Sarah snapped, her composure completely shattered. This is just Hilton trying to cause drama because he's jealous of our stability. Our stability, Marcus repeated thoughtfully. You mean the stability that's been built on manipulating family relationships and hiding inheritance documents? The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Through the front window, I could see Thomas's silver Honda Civic in the driveway, the headlights cutting through the early evening darkness. That would be Thomas, I said, standing and walking toward the front door. Hilton, don't you dare let him into our home, Mom called after me, but I was already turning the door handle. Thomas stood on the front porch carrying a leather briefcase, his gray hair neatly combed and his expression serious but determined. He was wearing his best suit, the navy one he typically reserved for church and important business meetings. Hilton, he said, gripping my hand firmly. I'm sorry it's come to this, but there are things you need to know immediately. Come in, Thomas. Everyone's in the dining room. As we walked through the hallway, Thomas leaned closer to me. Before we go in there, you should know that I have more than just estate documents. I have recordings. Recordings. Your sister isn't as careful with her phone conversations as she thinks. I've been documenting her communications for the past 2 months, ever since I became suspicious about the delayed estate filings. We entered the dining room where the family sat frozen around the catered feast like figures in a disturbing tableau. Emma and Jake had moved closer together on their floor blanket, holding hands as they watched the adult drama unfold. Good evening, everyone, Thomas said politely, setting his briefcase on the side table. I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but we have some important family business to discuss. Thomas, this is highly inappropriate, Dad began, but Thomas raised his hand. Actually, Robert, what's inappropriate is deliberately hiding inheritance documents from beneficiaries while allowing them to struggle financially. What's inappropriate is staging elaborate dinners to humiliate grandchildren who have legitimate claims to their great-grandfather's estate. Sarah's hands were shaking as she reached for her purse. I don't have to listen to this. Kids, we're leaving. Sarah, I wouldn't touch that phone if I were you, Thomas said calmly, opening his briefcase. Especially since I already have recordings of your conversations with Jennifer Morrison about destroying Hilton's credibility. The name Jennifer Morrison hit the room like a bomb. My ex-wife's maiden name, which she had resumed after our divorce, hung in the air as Sarah froze with her phone halfway out of her purse. You've been recording private conversations, Marcus demanded, his voice filled with shocked disbelief. I've been documenting evidence of inheritance fraud and conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, Thomas replied matter-of-factly. Sarah, would you like to hear the conversation from October 15th, where you promised Jennifer $50,000 if she could successfully alienate Hilton from his parents? Sarah's face went from pale to ashen. She sank back into her chair, her phone forgotten in her lap. $50,000. I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. You paid Jennifer $50,000 to destroy my relationship with my children's mother and my own parents. It wasn't like that. Sarah protested weakly, but Thomas was already removing a small digital recording device from his briefcase. Actually, it was exactly like that, Thomas said, pressing the play button. Sarah's voice emerged from the device, clear and unmistakable. Jennifer, I need you to understand how important this is. If Hilton maintains good relationships with Mom and Dad, he's going to contest the estate distribution. We need them to see him as unstable and irresponsible. Jennifer's voice responded, the custody battle is already costing him everything. His lawyer bills are crushing him financially. Perfect. That's exactly what we need. A man who can't afford his own legal bills clearly can't be trusted with inherited wealth. But I need you to keep pushing, keep escalating the conflict. The more desperate and angry he appears in court, the better our case becomes. The recording continued for several more minutes, detailing the calculated destruction of my marriage, my relationship with my children, and my standing within the family. Every accusation, every legal maneuver, every character assassination had been choreographed and financed by my own sister. Emma and Jake sat motionless on their blanket, too young to fully understand the conversation, but old enough to sense the profound betrayal unfolding around them. Jake's small hand found mine as I knelt beside their makeshift dining area. Daddy, Emma whispered, why did Aunt Sarah want to hurt us? The question pierced my heart because it was so innocent, so direct, so focused on the essential truth that had been obscured by months of legal manipulation and family politics. Sarah had deliberately hurt children to secure financial advantage for her own family. I don't know, sweetheart, I said honestly. But we're going to make sure it doesn't happen anymore. Thomas was removing more documents from his briefcase, spreading them across the dining table where the catered feast was growing cold. These are the original will and trust documents that Joe Morrison executed 3 months before his death. Hilton, your inheritance includes the lake cabin, $400,000 in liquid assets and trust funds totaling $50,000 for Emma and Jake's education. The room spun around me as I stared at the legal documents bearing my grandfather's signature. $400,000. Enough to provide security for my children to ensure they never again sat on floors during family dinners, to give them opportunities I had only dreamed of providing. There's more, Thomas continued, his voice gentle but firm. Joe included a letter specifically for you explaining his concerns about family manipulation and his hopes for your future with the children. He handed me a sealed envelope with "For Hilton Morrison" written in Grandpa Joe's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it, aware that everyone in the room was watching my face as I read my grandfather's final words to me. The letter was brief but devastating in its clarity, Hilton. I'm worried about Sarah's influence on your parents and her obvious resentment of your situation. I want you to know that your struggles as a single father have only increased my respect for you. Take care of Emma and Jake, and don't let anyone convince you that financial hardship reflects personal failure. You are a good man and a devoted father. The cabin has always been your sanctuary, and now it's your home. I looked up from the letter to find Sarah staring at me with undisguised hatred, all pretense of family affection finally abandoned. She had gambled everything on her ability to manipulate our parents and destroy my credibility, and now faced exposure of her criminal conspiracy. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her voice filled with venom. "Actually, Sarah," Thomas replied, removing one final document from his briefcase, "it is over. These are criminal referrals I've prepared for the district attorney's office detailing inheritance fraud, financial elder abuse, and conspiracy charges against both you and Jennifer Morrison." Thomas spread the documents across the dining table with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades organizing complex business transactions. The catered Thanksgiving feast became a backdrop for legal papers that would reshape our entire family dynamic. "Before we proceed," Thomas said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I want everyone to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. This isn't just about hidden inheritance documents. This is about a systematic campaign to defraud Hilton and his children while manipulating elderly family members." He pulled out a manila folder thick with papers and recordings. "I've been investigating these irregularities for 8 weeks, ever since I realized the estate filings were being deliberately delayed." Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Thomas, I had legitimate health concerns that prevented me from managing estate paperwork." "Robert, I have your medical records from August," Thomas replied calmly. "You had a routine physical examination and blood pressure check. There was no health emergency, no chest pains, no hospitalization. Your doctor confirmed you were cleared for normal activities immediately." The lie hung exposed in the air like a toxic cloud. Mom's face had gone ashen as she realized the extent of the deception that had been perpetrated in her own home. Thomas connected his phone to a small portable speaker. "I think you all need to hear the full scope of Sarah's planning. This recording is from September 23rd. Sarah's voice filled the room again, but this time speaking to someone other than Jennifer. "Marcus, you have to trust me on this. Once Dad files the amended will documents, Hilton will be completely cut out. The kids will have college funds, but everything else comes to our family. We're talking about over $1 million in total assets." Marcus's voice responded with obvious discomfort. "Sarah, this feels wrong. Hilton is working himself to death trying to provide for Emma and Jake. Maybe we should just let the inheritance be distributed as Joe originally intended." "Don't be naive," Sarah's recorded voice snapped. "Hilton had his chance to build financial stability, and he blew it with that divorce. Jennifer told me he was spending money on stupid things instead of fighting for custody properly. He doesn't deserve Joe's legacy." I felt my hands clenching into fists as I listened to my sister's casual dismissal of my struggles. The stupid things she referenced were Emma's orthodontic treatments and Jake's asthma medications. The custody fight I hadn't pursued properly was the one where I had refused to launch personal attacks against Jennifer because I wanted to protect my children from additional trauma. Thomas paused the recording. "Hilton, what Sarah just described as your poor financial decisions, what exactly was she referring to?" "Medical expenses for the children," I said, my voice tight with controlled anger. "Emma needed braces, and Jake's asthma requires specialized medications that aren't fully covered by my health insurance. So you chose your children's health over legal bills in the custody battle? Every time. I I wasn't going to let my kids suffer physically because their parents were fighting in court. Thomas nodded approvingly. That's exactly what Joe would have expected from you. Your grandfather specifically mentioned his respect for your priorities during difficult circumstances. He resumed the recording. Sarah's voice continued, "The beauty of this plan is that Hilton will never even know what he's missing. By the time everything is finalized, he'll be so exhausted from working multiple jobs and dealing with Jennifer's legal maneuvers that he won't have energy to investigate estate matters." "What if he finds out Marcus's voice?" asked. "He won't. Jennifer is keeping him completely occupied with custody drama, and I've convinced Mom and Dad that he's becoming unstable under the pressure. They actually believe he might be dangerous to the children if he doesn't get professional help." The room erupted as Mom gasped audibly and Dad slammed his hand on the table. "Sarah, how could you lie to us about Hilton's mental state?" "I didn't lie," Sarah protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "He has been under enormous stress. I was concerned about his judgment." Thomas pulled out another set of documents. "Actually, you did lie. These are transcripts of conversations where you fabricated stories about Hilton's behavior, including claims that he had been drinking, heavily missing work, and making threats against Jennifer." My stomach dropped. "I've never made threats against Jennifer. I barely speak to her except about custody arrangements." "I know," Thomas said gently. "Jennifer confirmed that in one of her conversations with Sarah. She specifically stated that you had been nothing but professional and courteous during all custody-related communications." He played another recording. Jennifer's voice was clear and unmistakable. "Sarah, I have to admit, Hilton has been handling this divorce much better than I expected. He hasn't said one negative word about me in front of the kids, and he's been flexible about custody scheduling when I need changes for work." "That's not what I need to hear," Sarah's voice responded sharply. "We need documentation of erratic behavior, poor judgment, anything that supports the instability narrative." "But there isn't any erratic behavior. He's actually been remarkably stable considering everything he's going through." "Then create some documentation." "Miss a few custody exchanges, claim he was late or seemed intoxicated. Something that shows a pattern of unreliability." The recording captured Jennifer's long pause before responding, "Sarah, you're asking me to lie about the father of my children. I'm asking you to secure their future. $50,000, Jennifer. That's more than most people make in a year. Your kids deserve financial security, and this is how we ensure they get it." I stared at the speaker in disbelief. Sarah had been coaching my ex-wife to fabricate evidence of my unfitness as a father. Every missed custody exchange, every report to the court about my alleged unreliability, every character assassination had been scripted and financially motivated. Thomas pulled out bank statements. These show the payments Sarah made to Jennifer's legal team, but there's more. She also made direct payments to Jennifer personally totaling $37,000 over 8 months. $37,000, I repeated numbly. You paid Jennifer $37,000 to destroy my relationship with my children. Emma and Jake had abandoned their floor picnic entirely, both children now sitting beside my chair as they sensed the magnitude of the adult conversation. Emma's small hand rested on my arm, offering comfort, despite her confusion about the complex dynamics unfolding around her. "There's something else." Thomas continued, removing a final recording device. "This conversation took place last week after Sarah learned that I had been asking questions about the estate delays." He pressed play, and Sarah's voice filled the room with chilling clarity. "Jennifer, we have a problem. Thomas Brennan is asking questions about Joe's will, and Hilton might find out about the inheritance he's supposed to receive." "What do you want me to do about it?" Jennifer's voice responded. "File an emergency custody motion. Claim that Hilton has become unstable and might pose a danger to the children if he learns about the money. We need him declared mentally unfit before he can challenge the estate distribution." "Sarah, I can't file false allegations about mental instability. That's perjury." It's not false if we document concerning behaviors. Start keeping a journal of incidents. Nothing dramatic, just subtle signs of deteriorating judgment and emotional control. You want me to fabricate a pattern of mental illness in the father of my children so you can steal his inheritance? I want you to protect those children from a father who might become dangerous when he realizes what he's lost. The recording ended in silence so profound, it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Sarah had been planning to have me declared mentally unfit to strip away my custody rights and my inheritance simultaneously, while positioning herself as the protector of my children's welfare. Marcus stood up slowly, his face pale with shock and revulsion. "Sarah, what have you become?" "I was protecting our children's future," she replied, but her voice was defensive and weak. "By destroying their uncle and cousins, by lying to your own parents, by bribing your brother's ex-wife to fabricate abuse allegations." Thomas gathered the documents and recordings into organized stacks. "Hilton, there's one more thing you need to know." Jennifer decided not to file the emergency custody motion Sarah requested. That's when Jennifer contacted me and agreed to cooperate with documenting Sarah's conspiracy. I looked up sharply. "Jennifer contacted you?" 2 weeks ago. She said she couldn't continue participating in Sarah's plan, especially after she realized the extent of the financial fraud involved. She's prepared to testify about the bribery and coaching if necessary. The irony was staggering. My ex-wife, the woman who had put me through months of legal hell, had ultimately refused to participate in the final phase of Sarah's conspiracy. Jennifer had drawn the line at falsely declaring me mentally unfit and potentially dangerous to my own children. "So Jennifer gets immunity in exchange for cooperation?" I asked. "Jennifer will face consequences for her participation in the earlier phases," Thomas clarified. "But her cooperation has been essential in documenting the full scope of Sarah's criminal enterprise." I looked around the dining room at the ruins of what I had believed was a family gathering. The catered food sat cold and untouched. The formal table setting now seemed obscene in its calculated staging, and the gifts beside my nephew and niece's plates looked like props in an elaborate theater production designed to humiliate my children. Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" The question cut through all the legal complexities and financial calculations to the heart of what mattered. My daughter wanted to know if her family would survive this betrayal, if her father could protect her and her brother from people who viewed them as obstacles to wealth accumulation. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, pulling both children closer to me. "We're going to be much better than okay." Sarah sat frozen in her chair, her carefully constructed facade completely demolished. The sister I'd grown up with, who had taught me to ride bikes and helped me with homework, had systematically planned the destruction of my family for financial gain. She had been willing to have me declared mentally ill and potentially strip away my parental rights to secure her children's inheritance. "Thomas," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake shaking my foundation. "What happens next?" "Next, we file criminal charges and civil suits. Next, we ensure that Joe Morrison's true wishes are honored and his great-grandchildren receive the inheritance and respect they deserve. Next, we make sure Sarah and Jennifer face appropriate consequences for their conspiracy." I stood up slowly, my children flanking me like small sentinels. The woman who had orchestrated months of legal torture, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse sat at the formal dining table surrounded by the evidence of her crimes. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I want you to look at Emma and Jake. I want you to remember that these are the children you were willing to destroy for money." For the first time all evening, Sarah's composure cracked completely. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at my children, perhaps finally comprehending the human cost of her calculated cruelty. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the apology felt hollow after months of systematic betrayal. "Sorry isn't enough," I replied, "but it's a start." Thomas methodically returned the documents to his briefcase. but kept several key papers spread across the dining table, like evidence in a courtroom. The formal dining room had transformed into something resembling a legal proceeding with my children as silent witnesses to their aunt's calculated betrayal. Hilton, before we proceed with criminal referrals, I need you to understand something important, Thomas said, removing his glasses to clean them with deliberate care. I'm not just your grandfather's former business partner. I'm also a retired estate attorney who practiced law for 42 years before joining Joe in the hardware business. The revelation hit me like cold water. Thomas wasn't simply a concerned family friend gathering evidence. He was a legal professional who had been building a comprehensive case against Sarah's conspiracy. "You're an attorney," I asked, feeling foolish for not knowing this crucial detail about a man I had known for years. Graduated Northwestern Law School in 1978, practiced estate and probate law until retirement. Joe and I became business partners after I decided I preferred selling tools to fighting legal battles. Thomas's weathered hands moved with professional precision as he organized documents. But when I realized what was happening to Joe's estate, I couldn't stand by and watch his grandchildren be defrauded. Sarah's face had gone completely white. She clutched her wine glass with trembling hands, realizing that her conspiracy had been uncovered by someone with the legal expertise to pursue criminal charges and civil damages. "What exactly does that mean for our situation?" I asked, trying to process this new dimension of support. "It means I've already filed preliminary paperwork with the probate court to freeze all estate assets pending a full investigation. As of this morning, Sarah cannot access any of the inheritance funds she believed she had successfully redirected to her children." Dad leaned forward, his voice shaky with confusion. "You froze the estate on what authority?" "On the authority of documented evidence showing inheritance fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes," Thomas replied calmly. "Judge Martinez reviewed my emergency petition yesterday and granted a temporary restraining order against all asset distributions until this matter can be properly investigated." The dining room fell silent except for the soft ticking of Mom's antique clock on the mantelpiece. The catered feast sat forgotten as the legal reality of Sarah's situation became clear. Furthermore, Thomas continued, "I've prepared criminal referrals for both Sarah and Jennifer Morrison. The district attorney's office has already agreed to review the case for potential prosecution on multiple charges, including fraud conspiracy and financial elder abuse." Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out as a whisper. "What charges specifically?" Thomas consulted a legal pad covered with his precise handwriting. "Inheritance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, financial elder abuse, bribery, conspiracy to file false legal documents, and potentially perjury depending on what testimony emerges during the investigation." Each charge hit the room like a physical blow. Mom gasped audibly, while Dad sat, frozen in his chair, apparently realizing for the first time that his daughter could face serious prison time. Prison time? Marcus asked, his voice barely audible as he stared at his wife with growing horror. "The inheritance fraud alone carries a potential sentence of 5 to 15 years under state law," Thomas replied matter-of-factly. "The elder abuse charges add additional penalties, and the conspiracy aspects could result in federal charges if the case meets certain criteria." I looked at Emma and Jake, who had moved even closer to my chair during this legal discussion. They didn't understand the complex criminal charges being discussed, but they could sense the fundamental shift in family dynamics occurring around them. "What about restitution?" I asked. "The money Sarah paid to Jennifer, the legal costs I incurred because of their conspiracy. Comprehensive civil damages will be pursued separately from criminal charges," Thomas explained. "Your actual losses include legal fees, lost wages from court appearances, medical costs for stress-related health issues, and punitive damages for the emotional distress inflicted on you and the children." He pulled out a calculator and legal pad, making quick notations. "Based on preliminary calculations, we're looking at approximately $85,000 in direct damages, plus punitive awards that could triple that amount. The numbers were staggering. Sarah could face both criminal prosecution and civil judgments totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, effectively destroying her family's financial security in pursuit of mine. There's more. Thomas continued, removing another set of documents. I've also contacted your former divorce attorney, Michael Chen, and he's agreed to reopen custody proceedings based on the new evidence of Jennifer's fraud and perjury. My heart stopped. Reopen custody proceedings? Jennifer's cooperation in the conspiracy, combined with documented evidence of her accepting bribes to fabricate testimony, constitutes grounds for modifying the original custody agreement. Michael believes we can secure primary custody for you, along with recovering legal fees Jennifer's fraud cost you. Primary custody. The word seemed impossible after months of limited visitation and carefully supervised time with my children. The custody battle that had nearly destroyed me financially and emotionally had been based on fabricated evidence and purchased testimony. How long would that process take? I asked, hardly daring to hope. Given the criminal evidence and Jennifer's cooperation, Michael estimates we could have modified custody arrangements within 60 days. The court doesn't look favorably on parents who accept bribes to provide false testimony against their children's other parent. Emma looked up at me with wide, hopeful eyes. Daddy, does that mean we could live with you all the time? The question pierced my heart because it revealed how much my children had longed for stability and normalcy, how much they had suffered during the artificial custody arrangements that Sarah's conspiracy had created. It might, sweetheart, I said carefully. We'll have to see what the judge decides. Thomas had more documents to review. Hilton, there's also the matter of your grandfather's true estate value. The preliminary assessment your family received was deliberately understated. Understated how Dad asked, his voice weak with growing realization. Joe Morrison's total estate, including the hardware store real estate investments and liquid assets, is worth approximately $1.7 million, not the $800,000 your family was told. The room spun around me. $1.7 million. My grandfather had been far wealthier than any of us realized, and Sarah's conspiracy had targeted a much larger inheritance than I had imagined. The hardware store alone appraised for $650,000. Thomas continued. Joe owned it outright, plus the building and 3 adjacent rental properties. His investment portfolio had grown considerably in recent years. I thought about the small hardware store where I had worked summer jobs as a teenager, learning about tools and customer service from Grandpa Joe. I had assumed it was a modest local business, not a significant commercial real estate investment. Sarah knew about the full estate value, I asked. She had access to preliminary asset assessments through your father. That's what motivated her to escalate the conspiracy beyond simple family manipulation into criminal fraud. The scope of Sarah's greed became clear. She hadn't just stolen a modest inheritance, she had targeted the majority of a substantial estate worth nearly $2 million. What's my actual inheritance under Grandpa's original will? I asked. Thomas opened a leather portfolio and removed the original will documents. You inherit the lake cabin valued at $280,000 plus $400,000 in liquid assets, plus your grandfather's share of the hardware store business, which is structured as a 50-50 partnership with me. My hands were shaking as I processed the numbers. The lake cabin alone was worth more than I had earned in the past 3 years combined. The liquid assets would provide complete financial security for Emma and Jake's education and future needs. The hardware store partnership would generate ongoing income for decades. You and I would be business partners, I asked Thomas. That was Joe's plan. He knew you had construction experience and good judgment about practical matters. He wanted to ensure the store continued serving the community while providing you with stable income and business ownership experience. I looked around the dining room at the ruins of what I had believed was my family. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, realizing that her conspiracy had not only failed, but would result in her own financial and legal destruction. Dad and Mom appeared devastated, understanding that they had been manipulated into betraying their son and grandchildren. Marcus stood up slowly, his face pale with shock and revulsion. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. I had no knowledge of any of this conspiracy. I was horrified when I started hearing the recorded conversations, and I'm completely disgusted by what you've done to your own brother and his children." Sarah looked up at her husband with desperate eyes. "Marcus, please, I was trying to secure our children's future. By destroying someone else's children, by bribing your brother's ex-wife to lie in court, by planning to have him declared mentally ill." Marcus's voice rose with each accusation. "Sarah, what you've done isn't just illegal, it's evil." The word hung in the air like a judge's verdict. Evil. Not misguided, not overly ambitious, not financially motivated, evil. Thomas gathered his documents into organized stacks. "Hilton, I need you to make some decisions about how you want to proceed. We can pursue criminal charges aggressively, or we can focus primarily on recovering your inheritance and ensuring proper custody arrangements." I looked at Emma and Jake, who had been silent witnesses to their aunt's exposure, as someone willing to destroy their family for money. I thought about the months of financial struggle, the nights I had lain awake wondering how to afford basic necessities, the humiliation of seeing my children treated as second-class family members. "I want both," I said quietly. "I want my inheritance restored, I want custody of my children, and I want Sarah and Jennifer to face legal consequences for what they've done." Thomas nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what your grandfather would have wanted." Joe Morrison was a man who believed in accountability and justice. I stood up slowly, my children flanking me as I faced the woman who had systematically planned the destruction of my family. Sarah looked small, and defeated, her expensive clothes and jewelry suddenly seeming like costumes in a play that had ended badly. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "You're going to face criminal charges and civil lawsuits. You're going to lose the money you tried to steal. But more importantly, you're going to live with the knowledge that you were willing to destroy children for financial gain." For the first time all evening, Sarah's composure cracked completely. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed, perhaps finally comprehending the full scope of what she had attempted and lost. "I'm sorry," she whispered through her tears. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," I replied. "But it's a start toward taking responsibility for what you've done." Thomas closed his briefcase with finality. "The legal proceedings will begin Monday morning. Hilton, you and the children should prepare for several weeks of court appearances and depositions, but the outcome is virtually certain given the evidence we've compiled." As I helped Emma and Jake gather their belongings from the living room floor, I realized that this terrible Thanksgiving had become the most important day of our lives. Not because we had gained an inheritance, but because we had discovered who truly cared about our family's welfare and who was willing to sacrifice our happiness for personal gain. "Daddy," Jake said quietly as we prepared to leave, "are we really going to be okay?" I knelt beside both children, pulling them close as I looked around the dining room one final time. The catered feast sat cold and forgotten. The formal table setting now seemed obscene in its calculated cruelty. And the family I had thought I belonged to had revealed itself as something far more complicated and dangerous. "Yes, buddy," I said firmly. "We're going to be much better than okay. We're going to be free." As Thomas began organizing his evidence for transport back to his car, Sarah suddenly lunged forward, panic overtaking her calculated composure. Her expensive bracelet caught on the edge of the tablecloth as she grabbed desperately for her phone, which had been recording incoming text messages throughout our confrontation. "I have to delete these messages," she said frantically, her fingers fumbling with the device. "People are going to misunderstand what happened here. Sarah, don't touch that phone." Thomas commanded sharply, his legal training evident in the authority of his voice. That device contains evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy. But Sarah was beyond rational thought. The reality of criminal charges and financial ruin had triggered pure desperation. She clutched the phone against her chest while backing away from the table, her eyes wild with fear. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising to a near shriek. "I have children to protect. I have a reputation in this community. People respect our family." "The family you've been destroying for over a year?" I asked, standing slowly as Emma and Jake moved behind me for protection. Sarah's response was to throw her phone toward the kitchen, apparently hoping to smash it beyond recovery. But her throw was wild and panicked, sending the device careening across the dining room instead. It struck the elaborate centerpiece Thomas had been carefully avoiding, sending the crystal vase autumn flowers and decorative gourds cascading across the polished table. The crash was spectacular and devastating. The centerpiece had been the crown jewel of Sarah's catered dinner presentation, an expensive arrangement designed to showcase her sophisticated entertaining style. Now it lay in ruins, flower water, spreading across the mahogany surface and soaking into the legal documents Thomas had carefully arranged. "My flowers!" Mom cried out, rushing toward the table as water dripped steadily onto the Persian rug below. But Sarah's desperate lunge for the phone had created more chaos than she anticipated. As she scrambled across the wet table surface trying to retrieve her device, her expensive heels lost traction on the water-slicked wood. Her feet went out from under her, and she crashed backward with surprising force. The impact sent her careening into Mom's antique china cabinet, a massive piece of furniture that had belonged to our grandmother and housed 4 generations of family heirloom dishes. The cabinet rocked violently as Sarah's body struck it, and I watched in horror as the glass doors popped open and precious plates began cascading to the floor. The sound was like gunshots, as dish after dish shattered against the hardwood. Mom's wedding China Grandma Morrison's Blue Willow collection, the everyday dishes from our childhood, all of it crashed down in an avalanche of broken ceramic and shattered memories. "No, no, no!" Mom wailed, dropping to her knees beside the wreckage as Sarah struggled to untangle herself from the fallen dishes. Emma and Jake had moved completely behind my chair now, both children frightened by the sudden violence and destruction. Jake was crying quietly, overwhelmed by the chaos and adult emotions swirling around him. Marcus stepped forward to help his wife, but Sarah pushed him away with surprising aggression. "Don't touch me. This is all your fault for not supporting the plan." "My fault." Marcus's voice carried a note of incredulous anger I had never heard from him before. "Sarah, I told you from the beginning this scheme was wrong. I begged you to stop manipulating your parents and leave Hilton alone." The admission hit the room like another bombshell. Marcus had known about Sarah's conspiracy and had tried to stop her. "You knew?" Dad asked, his voice weak with betrayal. "Marcus, you knew Sarah was lying to us about Hilton." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, his face flushed with shame and frustration. "I've been trying to talk sense into her for months. When she started talking about inheritance strategies and Hilton's unfitness as a father, I told her she was crossing lines that could destroy the whole family. Then why didn't you warn me?" I demanded, anger rising at the thought that my brother-in-law could have prevented months of suffering. "Because I hoped she would come to her senses before things went too far," Marcus replied miserably. "I thought the custody battle would end, and she would let the inheritance matter resolve naturally. I never imagined she would escalate to bribing your ex-wife or staging elaborate dinner theater." Sarah had finally extracted herself from the china cabinet wreckage, but her appearance was disheveled, and her expensive outfit was stained with flower water and dotted with ceramic fragments. She stood amid the destruction she had created, surrounded by the physical evidence of her complete loss of control. "This is all Thomas's fault," she said, pointing an accusatory finger at the elderly attorney. He had no right to investigate private family business. Private family business, Thomas replied with cold precision. Sarah, you committed multiple felonies. You defrauded your brother's children and conspired to have their father declared mentally unfit. That's not family business. It's criminal enterprise. The words criminal enterprise seemed to trigger something fundamental in Sarah's psychology. She began laughing, a high-pitched sound that was more hysteria than humor. Criminal enterprise. She repeated, her voice taking on a manic quality. I'm a suburban mother trying to secure my children's future. I'm not some kind of mob boss. Actually, Thomas said, consulting his legal notes, under federal conspiracy statutes, what you've done meets the technical definition of organized criminal activity. Multiple participants' financial crimes across state lines, and systematic fraud targeting vulnerable victims. The event coordinator, who had been hiding in the kitchen during the confrontation, finally emerged with obvious reluctance. Her professional composure was completely gone, replaced by the expression of someone who had inadvertently stumbled into a family nightmare. "Excuse me," she said tentatively, "but I think I should leave. This is clearly a private matter, and I don't want to intrude further." "Actually," Thomas said, "I'd appreciate if you could stay a few more minutes. Your testimony about Sarah's deception regarding the dinner arrangements could be valuable evidence." The coordinator's face went pale as she realized she had become an unwitting participant in documenting criminal fraud. "I just coordinate catering events. I don't want to be involved in legal proceedings." "Ma'am, you're not in trouble," I assured her. "But Sarah hired you to help humiliate my children, and that's something the court will need to understand." Sarah spun toward me with renewed fury. "I hired caterers to create a nice family dinner. There's nothing illegal about wanting proper table settings and good food. There is when it's designed as psychological warfare against children," Thomas replied matter-of-factly. "Deliberately staging their humiliation to support false narratives about their father's worthiness is a form of emotional abuse." The legal terminology hit Sarah like physical blows. Fraud, conspiracy, criminal enterprise, emotional abuse. Each charge was another nail in the coffin of her carefully constructed reputation and social standing. "What about my children?" she asked, suddenly her voice breaking as the reality of potential prison time began to sink in. "What happens to Madison and Cooper if I'm convicted of felonies?" Marcus answered before anyone else could speak, his voice filled with quiet determination. "They'll live with me, and they'll learn that their mother made terrible choices that hurt people they're supposed to love." The finality in his tone suggested that Marcus had been considering divorce proceedings for some time. Sarah's conspiracy hadn't just destroyed her relationship with our family, it had alienated her from her own husband and threatened her custody of her children. "Marcus, you can't be serious," Sarah pleaded, reaching toward him with desperate hands. "We can work through this. I can make restitution, I can apologize, I can fix everything." "Sarah, you tried to have your brother declared mentally ill so you could steal his inheritance. You bribed his ex-wife to lie in court proceedings. You manipulated your elderly parents and staged psychological abuse of their grandchildren." Marcus's voice was steady but filled with profound disappointment. "There's no working through behavior that evil." The word evil appeared again, this time from her own husband. Sarah looked around the dining room, taking in the destruction she had caused both literally and figuratively. Broken dishes covered the floor, legal documents were scattered across the wet table, and her family relationships lay in ruins around her. Emma tugged on my sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daddy, can we go home now? This place feels scary." Her simple request cut through all the legal complexities and adult drama to the essential truth. My children needed to be removed from this toxic environment, away from people who had demonstrated they were willing to sacrifice child welfare for financial gain. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, gathering both children closer to me. "We're leaving right now. As I helped Emma and Jake put on their coats, I looked back at the dining room one final time. Sarah sat amid the wreckage of Mom's china collection, her expensive clothes ruined, and her conspiracy exposed. The catered feast had grown cold and unappetizing, the formal table setting now seeming obscene in its calculated cruelty. Thomas, I said thank you for everything you've done for us. When do we need to meet to begin the legal proceedings? Monday morning, 9 o'clock at my office. We'll file the criminal referrals and begin probate court proceedings to restore your inheritance. Thomas handed me his business card, which I realized I had never needed before, despite knowing him for years. Will Emma and Jake need to testify about anything? Probably not in criminal proceedings, but they may need to provide statements for the custody modification hearings. We'll make sure they have appropriate support throughout the process. As we prepared to leave, Dad finally stood up from the dining table. His face looked years older than it had when we arrived, aged by the realization that he had been manipulated into betraying his son and grandchildren. Hilton, he said quietly, I don't know how to apologize for what we've done to you and the kids. I paused with my hand on the front door, Emma and Jake pressed against my sides. The man speaking was my father, someone who had raised me and taught me important values about honesty and family loyalty. But he was also someone who had allowed himself to be manipulated into treating his grandchildren as second-class family members based on fabricated stories about their father. Dad will need time to rebuild trust, I said honestly. But I'm willing to try if you're committed to treating Emma and Jake with the love and respect they deserve. They'll never sit on floors during family dinners again. He promised, his voice thick with emotion. They should never have had to in the first place, I replied, but without anger. Family means everyone belongs at the table. As we walked toward my truck, I could hear Sarah's voice through the front window, still pleading with Marcus to reconsider divorce proceedings. The sound faded as we drove away, leaving behind the ruins of what I had believed was a family gathering, but had actually been an elaborate stage production designed to justify stealing my children's inheritance. Emma and Jake fell asleep during the drive back to our small apartment, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the evening. As I carried them inside and tucked them into their beds, I realized that everything in our lives was about to change. We would have financial security, legal vindication, and most importantly, freedom from people who viewed us as obstacles to wealth accumulation. For the first time in months, I fell asleep without worrying about how to pay next month's rent or whether I could afford Jake's asthma medications. Sarah's conspiracy had been exposed, our inheritance would be restored, and my children would grow up knowing that their father had fought for them and won. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of Grandpa Joe's lake cabin, watching Emma and Jake chase fireflies across the meadow that sloped down toward the water's edge. The afternoon sun painted everything golden, from the weathered cedar siding of the cabin to my children's laughter echoing across the lake. This place had become our sanctuary, just as Grandpa Joe had intended. The legal proceedings had concluded even more successfully than Thomas had predicted. Sarah pleaded guilty to inheritance fraud and conspiracy charges, receiving an 18-month prison sentence and restitution orders totaling $137,000. Jennifer faced similar charges for her cooperation in the custody fraud, though her cooperation with prosecutors earned her probation and community service rather than prison time. More importantly, the custody modification hearings had resulted in Emma and Jake living with me full-time. Jennifer maintained supervised visitation rights, but the court had been clear about the serious nature of her perjury and the impact of her false testimony on the children's welfare. The judge had particularly harsh words for adults who allowed financial incentives to influence their testimony about child custody matters. Marcus had indeed filed for divorce, and he visited us regularly at the cabin with Madison and Cooper. The children were slowly rebuilding their relationship with their uncle and cousins, though it would take time for Emma and Jake to fully trust family members again. Marcus was determined to ensure his children understood the serious consequences of their mother's choices while maintaining hope that Sarah could eventually earn forgiveness through genuine accountability. The hardware store partnership with Thomas had exceeded all expectations. My construction background proved invaluable in helping customers with complex projects, and Thomas's decades of business experience provided guidance as I learned retail management and community relationship building. We had expanded the store's services to include tool repair and custom woodworking, generating steady income that allowed me to provide Emma and Jake with opportunities I had only dreamed of during our months of financial struggle. But the greatest transformation wasn't financial, it was emotional. Emma and Jake had blossomed in the stability of our lake cabin home, their personalities emerging with newfound confidence as they realized they would never again be treated as second-class family members. Emma had joined the local youth theater group and discovered a passion for storytelling, while Jake had become fascinated with lake ecology and spent hours examining water samples with the microscope Thomas had given him for his birthday. Dad and Mom had begun the slow process of rebuilding their relationship with us through weekly visits and family counseling sessions. The betrayal had cut deep, but they had demonstrated genuine remorse by selling their house and using part of the proceeds to establish college funds for Emma and Jake. They had moved into a smaller home closer to the lake, making it easier for them to be actively involved grandparents who showed up for school plays and soccer games. Mom had been particularly devastated by her role in the conspiracy, realizing that her willingness to believe Sarah's fabrications had led to months of emotional abuse toward her own grandchildren. She now spent Saturday mornings teaching Emma traditional family recipes, using the time to share stories about our family history and express her love through patient instruction and gentle guidance. The most unexpected development had been Thomas's integration into our daily lives. He had become the grandfather figure Emma and Jake had never really known, spending evenings on the cabin deck, teaching them card games, and sharing stories about Grandpa Joe's younger years. His presence provided continuity with family history, while offering wisdom gained through decades of legal practice and business ownership. On this particular evening, as I prepared dinner on the outdoor grill, I reflected on how profoundly our lives had changed since that terrible Thanksgiving dinner. The financial security was important, but the real transformation was in understanding which relationships deserved our trust and investment. Emma ran up to the deck, her cheeks flushed from running through the meadow. "Daddy, can we invite Uncle Marcus and the kids for dinner tomorrow? Jake wants to show Cooper the frog habitat he built down by the shore." The casual way she mentioned family visits demonstrated how much healing had occurred. 6 months ago, my children had been sitting on living room floors during family gatherings, treated as unwelcome guests in their own extended family. Now they felt secure enough to issue invitations and share their discoveries with cousins who were learning to understand the serious consequences of their mother's actions. "Of course, sweetheart. Call Uncle Marcus and ask if they'd like to come for barbecue and swimming." As Emma ran inside to make the phone call, I thought about the letter Grandpa Joe had left for me, which I now kept framed in the cabin's main room. His words about not letting financial hardship define personal worth had sustained me through the worst moments of Sarah's conspiracy, and his confidence in my abilities as a father had proven more valuable than any monetary inheritance. The evening concluded with Emma and Jake helping me clean up the dinner dishes while sharing stories about their day. These routine moments of domestic normalcy had become precious to me, representing the stability and security I had fought so hard to provide. As I tucked them into their beds, real beds in their own rooms, not temporary arrangements, in cramped apartments, I marveled at how far we had traveled from those dark months of legal battles and financial uncertainty. "Daddy," Jake said sleepily, "I'm glad Aunt Sarah can't hurt us anymore." His simple statement encapsulated the fundamental change in our lives. We were no longer vulnerable to people who viewed us as obstacles to wealth accumulation. We had legal protections, financial resources, and most importantly, a clear understanding of which relationships deserved our trust and investment. She can't hurt us anymore, buddy. I confirmed, kissing his forehead. We're safe, we're loved, and we belong exactly where we are. Later that evening, I sat on the cabin deck with a cup of coffee, listening to the gentle sounds of the lake and reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this place of peace and security. Sarah's conspiracy had been designed to destroy our family for financial gain, but instead, it had revealed who truly cared about our welfare and who was willing to sacrifice our happiness for personal advantage. The greatest gift hadn't been the inheritance money or the cabin or even the successful business partnership with Thomas. The greatest gift had been learning that we were stronger than I had ever imagined, that my children were resilient and loving despite the trauma they had endured, and that real family bonds are built on integrity and unconditional support rather than financial manipulation. As I prepared to go inside and join Emma and Jake in our comfortable home, I thought about families who might be facing similar betrayals or struggling with people who prioritize money over relationships. The legal victory was important, but the real triumph was in demonstrating that children's welfare must always come before adult financial schemes. I hope anyone listening to this story understands that standing up for your children's dignity and security is always worth fighting for, even when the opposition comes from within your own family. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not against strangers, but against people who should love and protect us, but choose personal gain instead. Financial security is important, but it should never come at the expense of treating children with the love and respect they deserve. Every child belongs at the family table, not sitting on floors, while others enjoy privileges based on adult conspiracies and financial manipulation. What would you do if you discovered that someone in your own family was systematically working to destroy your children's future for personal financial gain? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting your children from relatives who viewed them as obstacles rather than beloved family members? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to our story, and I hope it encourages you to always fight for the people who matter most, especially when they're too young to fight for themselves. Please like this video if it resonated with your experiences, subscribe for more stories about overcoming family betrayal and finding strength in difficult circumstances, and share this with anyone who might benefit from knowing that justice and healing are possible even after the deepest family betrayals. Remember that your children's dignity and security are worth more than any inheritance, and real family bonds survive even the most calculated attempts at destruction. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give our children is the knowledge that we will always fight for them no matter who stands in opposition.